I recently had the opportunity to explain many different aspects of my psychological personality models to many different people um, in small viewings or in small groupings, and that has allowed me to see more aspects from more different sides and to very simply get out some of the basics. And I'd like to almost try to retrace a lot of those. Uh, what I would consider to be very vital sort of constituent building blocks of getting a clear view of what's actually going on. Sadly, I think I won't be able to quite do that justice, but let me maybe attempt to kind of recapitulate some of those sort of keystones. So, just with one woman, what I was able to do, or she was quite interested in knowing just an overview essentially of my 17 cognitive functions, and she wanted to know a view of the whole system in some sense, but that wasn't really possible with the time allowed, and also my voice. I've been using my voice quite a bit, so over the past 4 days, either making recordings and talking to people, which has been a little bit taxing, but anyway. And I really got a lot out of explaining the 17 cognitive functions because I hadn't done that, or I mean, obviously not in the smallest detail, but in terms of the overview and how they sit together. And it sat with me quite clearly how it cohesively informs a philosophical worldview, and this somewhat reinforces some of the vague philosophical ramblings that I did right at the beginning of this kind of block of trying to reintroduce my models. And then I went into rambling about sort of esoteric philosophical things. And a lot of those arguments I feel like I refined, um, but I also hashed them out specifically where they are installed in some sense. And essentially, yeah, and I also did some wonderful things when I just basically explained pieces of my model in terms of like a greater context or an overarching, kind of summary, which I'm afraid I won't be able to probably remember all those little very useful tidbits, but okay, let me try. Um, so yeah, I mean, this led me into even thinking I could make a whole recording on certain standalone subjects, but sadly I won't be doing that either. Um, that are quite fertile subjects. It got me thinking that essentially spirituality really was revitalized or is made possible through the language of generally typology, but specifically through having something like cognitive functions. Because as soon as you've got a palette of cognitive functions, you have a closed system and you have a complete system or at least set of ingredients through which you can essentially explore how metaphysics furnishes experience, at least from a phenomenological or consciousness point of view. And so, yeah, how people then talk about cognitive functions, or at least how they talk about their opinions and judgments and how it all fits together, how it hangs together, um, the implications of how certain functions relate to one another, uh, you can quite incisively start to create your own sense of judgment, your own sense of discerning as to um, how parts of your experience, how parts of how parts of your experience should be digested by your understanding, and it lends authority to the understanding to be developed and to become an internal locus of control. Anyway, I'm just going to sort of leave that now as a sort of as a vignette and go on to a similar theme still, perhaps taking that heading a bit deeper, but in a different capacity. That when I was going through the 17 dimensions and going through the overview of them and how essentially the cognitive functions rely on one another, they form a kind of natural hierarchy, as it were, in that any cognitive function at a certain number, because they start from 1 and they end at 17, uh, if you are looking at the sixth dimension or the sixth cognitive function, and I sometimes call them dimension of psychological reality, because by saying dimension, I am invoking the fact that um, they are laid on top of one another, or could be said to be laid within one another. Um, that the weight of the structure or the operation that is happening on the sixth dimension is carried by, in some sense, a supporting or I want to say a sympathetic operation in all the prior numbered dimensions. So something happening on dimension 6 is also something happening on dimension 1. It's not the same thing as it is on dimension 1, but in some sense you could say it's a peculiar, a specific facet within dimension 1 that, at a deep enough level gives you a full description of what's happening on dimension 6. If you take the metaphor that the dimensions concentrically occur within one another. Um, and then there's a very particular break also between dimension 8 and dimension 9, and then all the dimensions above dimension 9, it gets more and more esoteric. Um, because essentially dimension 8 is the last dimension, which is sort of very tangible, very material, very sort of external in some sense, whereas dimension 9 and onwards is very much a kind of it's something that stays in people's interior. It's something that can be contended. It's almost it's much more closely linked to the concept of the spirit. It's sort of like the higher, you know, there. It's like a layer of, it's an overlay or an interpretation that you would, because essentially dimension 9 can be summarized as hope. And so everything above dimension 9 is just a facet of hope. Um, it's something that exists within the construct of hope, of hoping for something. Um, which I would say is very much linked to the concept of good faith. But anyway, if I wasn't sort of more tired, I think I would actually try to recreate that whole chain of in fact, maybe I should actually just go through the 17 dimensions to try to recreate that exposition. Okay, so I didn't go into the sub-units of the dimension. I just went into the overarching sort of formulas of the dimension and how they kind of sit together. So not the kind of the most detailed internal mechanics of each dimension, but just looking at it from a metaphysical picture. Oh, let me just continue to say, so when doing that, I discovered that around dimension 14, which I link to introverted thinking, and I also link to one of the aspects of one of the parts of the Trinity, the Word is dimension 14. That in some sense necessitates an internal locus of control. Otherwise, or the use of dimension 14, which is essentially made out of blame. Because if you do not blame, let's say, the space that is dimension 14 for the contents of dimension 14, then you have no ownership over your own mental furnishings. You have no ownership of your own mental objects. And which also means that you can then no longer, or thereafter in dimension 15, you can't have any introverted sensing over those objects because their energy doesn't belong to you in some sense, so you can't resonate with it. That form of SI, in some sense, again, that form of resonance and being able to refer to things with that kind of SI is so I'm recreating an explanation that I went into, and it's kind of uncalled for to talk about that facet, but essentially it's just to say that when you own these things, it doesn't mean that you exclusively possess them, because this is kind of an esoteric aspect of interpreting something. So it just means that you are familiar with it. So this kind of SI is a certain kind of resonance and familiarness, but that doesn't mean that it exclusively belongs to you. You can see that other people might have these virtues or these positive qualities, but essentially dimension 15 is what things are. The idea of what things are, being able to be situated in a reality that's populated by what things are, and your sense of and your view of the components of your reality that are made, or your experience that are made up of what things are. But the and so what is encoded into your references to what things are is this TI matrix that is behind it. But if you don't blame yourself for having a TI matrix, then essentially what things are just impositions. They are things that you have been granted from an external source. You don't have, you don't know what things are. So the world is dull to you, as it were. Um, and there are, I think, very common themes in psychology and culture and ideology, which I would say are alien forces on that TI that do get people into a kind of dysfunction um, with those higher dimensions, or they get dislocated from experiencing those higher dimensions, essentially. Um, because their own TI matrix is not theirs in some sense. It is they don't uh, they don't blame themselves for their own mental objects and their mental constructs and their own mental furnishings. Um, they have slavishly sort of taken some theory to supplant the blame of yourself in uh, operating that TI matrix in terms of that domain has been uh, outsourced to some external authority or some external locus of control. Um, which is regarded as a positive identity. And when I say positive identity, I mean it's regarded as a real identity, and then you become unreal. Um, Essentially, you become a kind of surreal thing, and you have to track and evaluate and reason and take on the perspective of that external identity, which then becomes this kind of which is weird because then it forces you to take on that disembodied perspective, but also that disembodied perspective has to essentially function on generalizations, because that's the only way that you can sort of channel its perspective is through some hypothetical emulation from that identity's perspective. And so, in some sense, you have found an object within your own TI domain to be the central engine of the TI domain. So you've actually found a kind of an element within that TI domain, a piece of furniture, and then you've essentially made that your God. You've made that your authority, rather than, in essence, resonating with a system of cohesion and a style of cohesion that is even capable of packing up its own TI matrix and rebirthing it and replacing it with a new one, but not jettisoning the responsibility that still accrues from, because essentially the old SI from the old TI doesn't just get blotted out. It doesn't just get erased. Uh, anyway, this is a bit of an esoteric thing, but there are things in that SI which can be discharged, can be exhausted, can be eventually forgotten, but that has to be an organic sort of process. You can't just kind of say, well, I'm a new TI now, I'm a new dimension 14, so my responsibility just sort of changes. And then essentially with slave morality and with the concept of also the very pernicious contemporary ideology of identity politics, essentially you get things imputed to you based on collecting you in a generalization of some identity that supposedly has this blame of this TI. Just kind of like looking at everything in the world space. Anyway, I almost feel like I shouldn't have brought that up, but that is a theme that I'm going to explore more generally, because that is actually a very common recurring sort of psychological philosophical theme that I'm going to be getting into, which is why I keep on complaining about TI cults and science and sort of the very weak philosophy of science and so-called things like that, but how those are just species of a kind of a psychological and intellectual um, mistake, which is quite common. Okay, let me first talk about the 17 dimensions, and then I'll be in a better position to talk about that subject. Okay, so the first dimension of psychological reality is a form of extroverted feeling, and I would describe it as in in the thinking in the formation of what will be, or in the formulation. Yeah. So if you have a thought that essentially is in the formulation of what will be, that is a form of extroverted thinking of the first dimension. Because the reason why I specify it like that is because there are three types of extroverted feeling in my cognitive system. In some sense, when I call this an extroverted feeling, that's just a descriptor. It's a bit of a vague label. In the truest sense, I have 17 dimensions. I have 17 cognitive functions. So I don't really have 8 cognitive functions. I have 17 cognitive functions. But just for ease of reference, I have decided to also use the Jungian 8, as it were, and I have my own 8 definitions of those cognitive functions, which then obviously have to be slightly broad and technical to cover the multiple versions of them, but it works well enough that it doesn't break my system, and it, as I say, it facilitates an ease of reference. Um, okay, so the first dimension is what will be. Uh, is thinking in the formulation of what will be. Now, because this is the first dimension, all other dimensions are also subvariants of what will be. They also include a component of what will be. There is no thinking impossible. There's no thinking that is possible without it being based on this form of extroverted feeling. So every kind of thought that you can have in your head is comes with it, at least a constituent of it, or it comes in some sense basically premised in the inclination of what will be. So not only am I going to give the formulation of the dimension, I'll obviously give some commentary on the dimension, maybe how it sits with the other dimensions, or primarily dimensions are very related to dimensions that come after it and dimensions that come immediately proceeding from it. Or that it proceeded from, rather. So the dimension right above and right below, and by the way, right below dimension 1 is dimension 17. But that's a special relationship that I'll treat when I reach dimension 17. So dimension 1 is between dimension 2 and dimension 17. And in some sense, it's also supported by dimension 17. But yeah, I'll talk about that paradox later. So the okay, so let me just say that I have, when dealing with this system, because they do have subcomponents, which I'm not going to go into in terms of the actual mechanics. Like I do have other technical ways of talking about these dimensions to be very, very precise. But I gave them one-word titles. And the one-word title that I gave to this FE is instinct. So I will be talking about the one-word titles because I think that also unlocks a lot of explanation and meaning, or at least description. Okay, so dimension 1, what will be? Instinct. So when I say what will be, okay, no, never mind. I'll talk about that on the next one. Okay, so that's dimension 1. Dimension 2 is thinking, or when I say thinking, I should just say a conscious experience of the conscious grammar, the grammar of consciousness that takes on the form of how things would be. Dimension 2 is how things would be, things that conform to that formula. And how things would be, I actually I should make, maybe, I don't know when I should make these esoteric comments, but dimension 1 I sometimes also like to think about as the flesh, in almost the I'm going to make a kind of a little bit of an esoteric Christian doctrine running commentary on these dimensions as well, because they do all these cognitive functions as they fit together. They do inform a cohesive metaphysic. I mean, I've already mentioned the Trinity on dimension 14. Okay, so dimension 2 I often think of as the spirit, and it's a form of introverted feeling. So dimension 2 is introverted feeling, how it would be. So if you have a sense of how it would be, you know the purpose in the thing that you're talking about. What is the tendency of purpose in something is, I think, what you glean from thinking how it would be. What is it going towards? What is it pointing at? Where will this take you? And in some sense, the spirit is the seat of understanding. In some sense, the first dimension is almost like a base raw material, and only when the second dimension is placed on top of it and sort of gives it something to comparatively work with, it sort of brings order to the perhaps the chaos of what will be. And so, as I say, like the second dimension is the first thing that actually sort of modulates the basic. Because if I say that, well, everything has dimension one in it, and almost everything has dimension two in it, except for the most basic thought, which is pure instinct. So I would say that animals have dimension one, but human beings have dimension two and all the other ones. And the reason why we have all the other ones is also because they are layered and are supported by dimension two. So dimension two is what makes us distinct from animals. And remember, there's 17 dimensions, so you can just see how much more sophisticated and profound consciousness is in the human than it is in other species, or at least species that don't have dimension two. I would say dimension two is the sine qua non of sentience. That maybe your dimension two isn't working so well, but the potential that you have for dimension two, even to operate on dimension two, because you can be affixed to a chaotic purpose. You can be affixed to a purpose or an understanding which is trying to mimic kind of instinctual mimicry or randomity or something like that you're trying to kind of so you can be an agent of chaos. You can try to I would essentially call that some species of nihilism. Interesting, I had an interesting conversation where I think I quite well argued that vegetarianism is very much akin. I mean, not sufficiently so, but I think that it does have a toxic effect in breeding a certain form of nihilism, which I would also link to my criticism of science in terms of putting people in a disembodied perspective. But essentially, because animals are likened to humans, and the significance of the difference of animals to humans in what humans have and animals do not have is essentially generalized into some uh, special regard that is owed to animals from what, like from a morality that does not um, affirm the the profound distinction that humans have and that human morality has. Uh, the idea that, oh well, we have human morality, so let's just give a free gift of regarding other things as if it was likened that they had our moral system or our moral capability. Or when I say that, I mean in terms of the ethical integrity of something that only sentience confers, and that because it doesn't care about the distinction between sentience and non-sentience. Um, anyway, uh, that I actually did a very bad job of kind of repeating that line of argument, but in some sense, I think that is there is really something to that argument. Okay, let me just move on. So how it would be. So I would my one word for how it would be, and this is a bit annoying because I kind of made up this word. It isn't a real word. Placidity, and the word placidity is kind of made up of the connotation of two words, placid, meaning sort of tranquil to some degree, but also it's meant to sort of connotate and I can't even remember the base word that I kind of sort of combined it from, but facile. So it's meant to be a combination of placid and facile. That something is able to be molded. It's something that's able to sort of to take form. Um, because it's not pliable to it it's not pliable relative to its own operations in some sense, but as a kind of relative, at least to the flesh, so it's almost like from the outside, you can't know what it is unless you're looking at it from the inside. It doesn't, you can't understand it except to emulate it, except to get inside of its perspective in some sense. And so it's peaceful on the inside, but it's sort of facile on the outside. So anyway, it's a bit of a mystery to some degree. How it would be, So I mean, you can really, spirituality or the spiritual perspective can be seen as having an eye, that it is to see things with understanding, um, and that is how you see things, by understanding them. Okay, anyway, let me just move on. So the third dimension is a form of introverted thinking, and I have less description for this than for other dimensions because it doesn't. It's one of the special dimensions which is very much connected to people's. There's some faculties which are kind of like, or there's some cognitive functions which are very closely related to objects in the mind, and there are some faculties which are too much closely tied to the awareness of those objects in some sense. And there are 5 dimensions that specifically stand out as being more closely related to uh, framing the wheels within wheels within wheels, and some of those wheels are quite pivotal uh, in different ways in managing and conducting, all the other sort of mechanistic features of consciousness in some sense. And so this is one of those special ones, and it is a form of introverted thinking, and I call this who I am. So your sense of who I am is going to, which you could call it your name, how you know yourself, is going to inform your uh, it is going to contract or contextualize how you define things. This is almost the kind of this is the same concept as that when people try to make artificial intelligence, it doesn't mean anything unless it's embodied in something. It's very much that concept. And I might as well say this because if you're watching my YouTube videos, I mean, you don't have to believe this, but I'll just say it anyway. But those ideas about artificial intelligence needing to be embodied, they originated from me. They originated from conversations with me on this subject, and I inserted that. But anyway, I'll move on. But th- that is obvious. So in some sense, it's an anchor. It's an anchor for meaning. That you need to have a certain stable edifice or platform upon which things can start to be formulated in terms of TI definitional meaning or whatever. So, it's like subject object. So the object has certain implicit implications as they are uh, um, engaged by and interacted with the subject. And so the TI, who I am, has a conducive um, uh, definitional implication, or at least this kind of TI, you could also be seen as it's very much to do with potency and potential. That you cannot imagine things. I mean, this is also why certain types of hypothetical thinking and generalization is void, is literally void. And this also leads on when I finish with the 17 dimensions, I will talk about some of these generalized philosophical issues because they are very important and they do crop up all over the place, and why you get so much bad philosophy, so much confused thinking. Um, okay, anyway, let me move on. So the fourth dimension is a form of introverted sensing, and it is what should be. Oh my word, I've just said the wrong thing. It's not what should be. It's what would be. What would be. Oh yeah, this is actually the time at which I have to talk about should and would. Um, Man, there's no getting around this. It's actually horrible. Um, in English grammar, when speaking and also writing, there is an unavoidable ambiguity when using the word should or would. The reason why there is ambiguity is because whether it means something, should and would does mean something different, but you don't know the, and that difference is a distinct difference. But you can refer to both of those things with the word should and would, depending on how it's interpreted. And so it can either be interpreted from the first person perspective, or it can be interpreted from the third person perspective. So this is the problem, is that you don't know if, when I say something, are you supposed to emulate that? Are you thinking it? Are you thinking what I'm saying? Are you channeling it and then saying, okay, so what he said, I'm supposed to imagine that that's coming from me? Or are you supposed to imagine a third person doing it and you looking at it from the outside, and then they are reporting it? But is that report, so you see the objective report of the thing happening to somebody else, to a third person, you can see how this turns into an infinite regress potentially as well. It's very annoying. Like, so how am I referring to it? So all of the languages I'm using is meant to be the subjective first person. So I use should and would, and then there's a difference. There's a distinction between should and would, and I think that you can most, I don't. There's no consistent way to refer to it other than if you're going to talk about it in third persons. If you're going to talk about it coming from third persons, then you have to talk about if they are interpreting it as if they are doing it in the first person, or if they're doing it yet in another third person, sort of, which starts becoming a bit ridiculous and nonsensical very quickly, because it does fall into an infinite regress. Man, it's so hard to explain this. But okay, so and this, I mean, this confusion generally comes from the fact that if something is a subjective first person report that is declaring what it is that they are reporting, um, again, you don't know if they're reporting it ready to be processed by your interpretation of their experience from the outside, or if you're supposed to be empathetically emulating their experience by copy pasting their sentiment that they have communicated as being their visceral, immediate experience, which then you are supposed to empathize by emulating directly, or if they have already given you the prompt to emulate it by objectifying it as a third person because they are respecting the fact that they are not you, and so then they are framing it in the third person and expecting you to digest it and to translate it into a first person emulation. So that's the ambiguity. I'm sorry, it is complicated. So there is a distinction between should and would, but what the distinction actually is contextualized as to how the person is communicating. If they are communicating the immediate direct thing which you're supposed to copy paste, or if they are um, expecting you to translate it into the first person because they know that you are hearing your report and that it has already been formulated in the third person. Um, yeah, so you could call it style of communication ambiguity, perhaps, or something. I don't know. Um, okay, so the fourth dimension is thought in the formulation of what would be. So that's why I give that whole. That's why I precisely try to lay it out like that, because I'm inducting you into contextualizing it as that this is what you would say from your first person perspective. This is how you would viscerally engage with that cognitive function. Anyway, so anyway, I'm contextualizing how you're supposed to uh, uh, understand it, I guess, so that you can sort of know what I'm talking about. But anyway, so what would be? So the fourth dimension, what would be, is a form of introverted sensing. And this, in the scriptures, I believe, is what is meant by the water, because the water is clear, but it can also diffract light. It's a medium, but it's also transparent, or it should be transparent, perhaps. Or if it has sediment in it, if it has residue in it, you can transparently see the murkiness of the water, as it were. You can see the defect, you can see the degradation in water. It's necessary, but it doesn't taste like much, as it were. But anyway, okay, never mind those sort of. Okay, that's a bit of a useful, a bit of a useless sort of poetic treatise. But so what this SI is in terms of what would be, it's also very much connected in chakra systems to sort of the top of the stomach, the sort of the solar plexus, I think. But I would link, the Dantian perhaps as well in Chinese. That it is. I actually call this dimension moderation, but you can also call it, I think, suggestion, because it's a gut feeling about. So like what would be is a concrete suggestion that is being aimed at. Uh, Now, this doesn't mean that it can't sort of just sort of be feeling based in some sense. But in some sense, it's like implying concrete suggestions and constraints, as it were, or you're communicating a certain kind of suggestive um, moderation to or through I mean, if you were to communicate on this cognitive function to somebody else, um, you are essentially imposing your sensibilities of moderation in some, you know, as to whatever substance you're communicating in the form of what would be. Um, so would is I use would and ought interchangeably. So you could also frame it as I mean, to me it's synonymous. What ought be, what things ought be, or what things ought be like, or what things would be like. Those are all perfect equivalents. It is a bit interesting that you see dimensions that have the word what in them can leave out. Sometimes I will say it, sometimes I will say things, and those are just placeholders for the substance, for the particular substance. So like what it would be like, what things would be like. Things might, might be more general because, sometimes you're not just referring to one thing, you're referring to a set of things or to a state or and then essentially the weird thing about what is that if you say things or something like that, I feel like you have to kind of grammatically just kind of fill it out. And then it's interesting that, you know, this isn't yet esoteric. So this does not, this type of SI does not rely on what things are. So if you are suggesting what things would be like, you don't have a definition of what things are yet. So I mean, it's interesting that even the even in the esoteric later on when I talk about what things are, you could also frame that as what things are like, or what it is like, because it's self or on that dimension. Then finally, you are defining the core of what things are like. Anyway, but it's it's weird that you can use that word like, and it effectively that is the closest you get to actually some kind of it's just in the scientific worldview, the idea of what things are is always taken to be a deterministic external authority, an objective paradigm that you have to actually ground that perspective in a kind of in some kind of theory, which is sort of given a free pass as to having its own TI sort of independent matrix somehow, even though it's sort of so you have to almost anthropomorphize reality to some extent to say that, oh well, it has some kind of logical source code that as a unimatrix sits behind everything. That blind faith somehow just goes by the board. Somehow everyone just ignores that that's what atheists are doing. um, that somehow we are living in the mind of science, essentially. Technically, I mean, I know that if an atheist is listening to this at this point, they'll say, "Well, that's a bit of a straw man," and let me just then correct that slightly. It's not actually living in the mind of science. Let me be precise. It's living in the mind of the concept of time. It science really treats time so poorly, um, because science can't tell us anything about time. The concept of the timeline, the concept of time as a field in science is very problematic because time is already abused in the methodology of science, because you have to believe that the past, what is giving you the past and what is producing the future, is the same process. You already have to blindly presume determinism. And if you don't do that, you don't even get science to begin with. And so to think that science can tell you anything about time when it already presumes so much about it is a bit ridiculous. And so what you are actually doing is whenever you're talking about science telling you something, in some sense you're saying Big Daddy Time is doing everything. You are actually making time the operative causative agent, essentially, and then you are just that's what science is. You're looking at the universe from this theory of time's perspective, from this particular narrative of time. So it forces you to vest this to deny yourself and to adopt this narrative of time, which I would say becomes essentially a false religion and a false god at that point. But you know, not very bright people sort of thinking about these things too clearly. But anyway, okay, let me move on. So the fifth dimension is a form of extroverted intuition, and it is a conscious operation in the formulation of how things will be, or how it will be. Okay, so how things will be is an extroverted intuition because it gives you a sense of potential engineering that you might do. So it's like, it's not a particular use of an instrument. It's like, well, these are the possibilities of how I might be able to engineer different things and do different things. Um, I call extroverted intuition prudence because, you know, it tells you about the you know, so you can have and I can't remember I'm sorry, I'm trying to recreate something that I said to somebody else, and it doesn't really work when they don't when I don't have the same dialogue partner, as it were, but prompting me with a particular question or something. But yeah, so how things will be. So that will be a scope of potential engineering, how you might engineer how things will be. And I just call that prudence in some sense, because you can obviously also use that to choose which strategy might be better than another strategy in terms of how things will be. So in some sense, it's not about strategy, it's about understanding the engineering of possibility in a broader sort of sense. And then you obviously, that would give you the ability to contrast between those possibilities. Um, but that choice of contrast or whatever comes much later. This is just the awareness, in some sense, of how things will be. The sixth dimension is a form of introverted feeling, um, and it is uh, so I'm just trying to remember what I keep on saying. It is a conscious operation in the form why things should be, or why it should be. See, like when I put it in the singular rather than in the group noun plural, it can also sometimes make it easier to sort of grab a hold of. But so when I say it, again, that's a placeholder for whatever thing you might be thinking, as long as it fits into that sort of form. So why why things should be. So your idea of why things should be is is not the same thing as would. Should here means that essentially it is almost like a, this is a bit technical and esoteric to get into, but like why things should be is kind of both positive and negative. I always relate why things should be to I guess please forgive me for going through the metaphor before explaining it, but I relate it to the salt because salt is ionic, and so it forms these crystals, and it's very hard to break um, with heat. It can take a lot of heat uh, before you break those bonds, and but it's very easy to crack, and a chip can split a whole salt crystal, because it just sort of brings it into unalignment or disalignment. So the thing about the salt is that, like, if you're going to use it positively to do something, it gets defective, and then the whole thing gets defective. Like the salt loses its saltiness is one of a script is a scriptural reference. And so the idea of why it should be um, conscious operations of the formulation, why it should be, it's kind of like an all or nothing sort of thing. That it's good salt, and it's kind of and it supports what you want to do in some sense. Yeah, excuse me for going more abstract, I guess, but another thing that I would use to describe the sixth dimension is just basically the concept of dialectical um, synthesis. Almost sort of Hegel and sort of but I mean, forget the synthesis and just look at the dialectical part, that you can always find why it should be giving you insight, or giving you a model of something that is structured and balanced by opposing forces, that it's gridlocked into as almost like a salt, like in how salt is layered in lattices of positive and negative charge. That it forms these stable ionic structures. Um, why it should be gives you a similar type of crystallized view it almost gives you a static view of the account for uh, uh, so it gives you these quite solid, robust, full, broad pictures, or encompassing pictures, not perhaps broad, because I don't want to imply that it's vague, but it gives you, because it's not vague, it's sort of in a kind of particular nitty gritty way, in terms of even how salt hooks itself together, that in the detail that it is finely calibrated and balanced and stable and static. Why it should be, why things should be. So the sentiment of why things should be gives you this recourse to the importance of structure that is balanced in its own internal sort of dynamic or dialectical perspective. And so I call why it should be eminence, because I do feel that when you're using this type of introverted feeling, when you have an operation on that fits the formulation of why things should be, uh, perhaps on the connotation that you are embodying a form of eminence, which is borrowed from how eminent these concerns are, that there must be stability, there must be structure. Um, that things must fit together. Uh, See, apart from all that metaphor, I wonder if I've actually made a good description of it or not. It certainly is quite abstract, but so I don't know if I've actually succeeded, perhaps in. I mean, sort of some of the subcomponents of this is that this is actually quite this is quite more complicated than the other dimensions to go into, because in some sense it is a bit amoral in a lot of ways. It is a bit which is perhaps strange when talking about introverted feeling from a MBTI type sort of perspective. Um, although I think there are probably FI users that do exemplify this form of FI. But anyway, you could link it to the concept of order very easily. I think that things have a natural place and have a natural order in a kind of motif, perhaps even. But and it can also certainly be a vice in excess to not being the foundation of the further more sophisticated dimensions. But in some sense, I think the point of this dimension is that you have to have salt about you to be able to know how to receive something, to receive an idea. It has to resonate with you, and you have to know how it resonates with you. You have to know how ionically poisonous it is to your current system, even if your system is perhaps got the wrong salt in it, but you don't know that yet. But in some sense, it has to be received by because at some point it has to fit together in a lattice, and so and some lattices maybe have errors in them, but and then you do have to be able to kind of start again. You do have to kind of create a new sort of ionic structure. Um, as I say, it's sort of like an all or nothing thing, because so like you could say that someone's sixth dimension, or why it should be, is like their own little salt crystal that is their particular kind of saltiness, or whatever. And this is a man, I'm really suffering trying to explain this. And in some sense, it really dictates how you receive things. It really dictates how you are able to receive things to a large extent. It's not so about it's not so much about content as it is about form. But that's going to sound a bit paradoxical. But it generally it leads to how you are capable of sort of in the same way that people use crystals as antennas to receive information. It kind of decodes vibrations and frequencies. Crystals in their lattices, in their ionic structures, are have such uniform structures that they are uniformly sensitive to transmuting, or allowing signals to be received because of their uniform order and internal dialectical. Uh, uh, I mean, it is a bit like a matrix, but I don't want to keep on using the same words. But uh, yeah, I mean, lattice, I think, is the best sort of metaphor here. And so people definitely will have differences in style of receiving things, and that will also be part and parcel of, in some sense, it is an expression of the content to some degree as well. It is an expression of how their sense of engineering works. So you can see how Dimension 5 and Dimension 6 are. You can see how the one follows on from the other one. That it is a kind of an inculcated manifestation of one's engineering in a sensitive lattice, or sensitive, but also, when I say sensitive, I mean in the degree to which it is sensitive. So it's either sort of sophisticated and nuanced and sensitive, or the lack thereof, to the degree to which that it's sort of, so it's the face of the NE, in some sense, of the fifth dimension, of how things will be. So it's kind of like the lattice that crystallizes your view of how things will be, to kind of look at it from the other side of dimension six. Um, sorry, to look at it from below dimension six, from dimension five. I should have also said more interesting things about dimension four, because the water is. Let me not go back, or I'll spend forever doing this. But yeah, there are lots of interesting insights and things like that between these things. Okay, dimension seven is a form of extroverted feeling. This is one of the other special ones, so it's kind of hard to pin this down. I would link this to. I'm not entirely sure what I should call this form of extroverted feeling. Might call it I am that I am. Might call it I am what I am. Yeah, dimension seven. I find it difficult to give it a formulation. Um, but in some sense, it's the embodiment of the last dimension, as they all are the embodiment of the aggregated sort of perspective that comes after the last dimension is done in its sort of aggregate summation, and let's just go with I am what I am. So uh, what can I say about it? So the most important thing, I think, to contextualize this is the last dimension, is the sixth dimension, which is why things should be. So if you're dealing with the thing that operates above why things should be, you're dealing with a kind of embodied agent that is operating from a certain structure. So there is something closed about I am what I am. What I am is taken, is being defined and being operated on, or being operated from the basis thereof. Um, and that's in a process of becoming, in some sense. It's which is essentially what is described in that what it is that it is becoming is what it is doing on that. So it is rendering that what it is agentically um, expressing uh, that I am what I am. Um, uh, and it's doing so with and between everyone's sense of why things should be. So, it needs to be able to operate against differing schools of why things should be, differing types of salts, different, you know, it has to represent its own eminence in the contest of other differing eminences, and perhaps also has to um, well, I mean, in this sense, it's taken its eminence for granted, but it has to be able to also treat other people's. Yeah, the Dimension 7 is very sort of mysterious because it is also a little bit sympathetically linked with the concept of the Holy Ghost, but Dimension 11 is actually the Holy Ghost. But anyway, there's this very interesting connection between Dimension 7 and Dimension 11, and Dimension 11 is actually I am what I am and extroverted intuition, and Dimension 7 is extroverted feeling, and I almost feel like the extroverted feeling of Dimension 7 is a very important precursor to Dimension 11. I connect Dimension 7 to the concept of the blood. Um, the blood, which is the content and the residue and the substance that drives life. There is nothing that you don't think about that doesn't find its way physically in some form, either as a power of cognition that one has the potential to or the aftermath of cognition that resides and lies as a record of what one has contemplated. So it's in the mix. It's in the blood. It's you have access to your window of consciousness, to a record of your consciousness. You have a view of the workings of your consciousness, um, literally sort of embodied in your blood. And this is we feel this as a form of extroverted feeling. We feel this as being able to see the potential and the potential of realizing an expression uh, that we've seen the potential for, that an expectation of what is realizable, or and I'm kind of butchering my definition. Let me just get I've got a generic definition of extroverted feeling. Let me just read that out. Determination of expression, in brackets, any presentation, by realizing the potential of situation, in brackets, any substance. And the brackets kind of really take that definition into a level of abstraction, which makes it quite amenable to being metaphorically represented by the blood, um, along the lines that I've just described. But determination of expression. So, in some sense, Dimension 7 is actually deciding that that determination. It is expressing uh, let's say, an actualized or a realized potential of a situation. Um, so it can see the potential in substances. It can see um, what presentation is worth determining. Um, Man, I'm being a bit loose with my own definition there, but uh, anyway, Dimension 7 is hard. uh, because in some sense it is a bit of an idea of manifest destiny that has an embodied component to it, or an incarnated component to it. Okay, next dimension, dimension 8, is how things would be, which is a form of extroverted sensing. So operations in the formulation of how things would be in the mind. When I say operations in the mind that fit the formulation of how things would be. So again, how things would be is very, all of these first 8 dimensions are very embodied. They're very tangible, as tangible as cognitive functions can be, I guess. How things would be. So how things would be is again like this form of extroverted sensing is very much about being able to immediately appraise a situation and see what's potential in a situation, but it's a bit more than potential. It's more about the real, actual um, some sense it's made real just by sensing it, just by seeing the potential of it means that potential doesn't even have, as long as because the potential is, if it's real in this sense of appraisal, just by appraising it, it that value essentially is exploited by this form of uh, let me call it a sensibility. Um, so my generic definition of extroverted sensing is experiencing the present context and appraising its potential. So it is very much about sort of visceral experience. This one, at least, how things would be. Like in some sense, it is more ideal than what is. It's I guess the thing that I have to emphasize is that it's not experiencing the present as a what. It's experiencing the present as a how, and it's not the present as a what. It's the present context in the dimension, or sorry, in the theme of how that context is is uh, um, is engineered, I guess, to reuse some words. So appraising those things, how things would be, it's, I mean, the idea of how things would be might seem very intellectual, but it's very immediate in terms of, like, you can imagine things. Just because you can imagine how things would be is not the same thing as actually having the sensibility or the appraisal of how things would actually be. How things would be cannot be dislocated and placed inside of a hypothetical generalization. So if you put that caveat into the notion how things would be, then you see how it has to be rooted in the present, and it has to be focused on the present and not on a fictional present or some kind of ulterior thought experiment. Um, yeah, so it's so the idea of how things would be is, in some sense you could say it's a form of intuition. I mean, I'm using this very much metaphorically. It's a form of intuition about the present, not about yourself, not about the I, not about your willpower. So it has nothing. It transparently sort of becomes an awareness of, um, how the present is constructed, uh, without any special regard for your, let's say, private or internal intuition, but in some sense, so it's like having an intuition for the present, having an intuition about the present context, which obviously is going to be informed by, you can only build that within your own mind, and therefore, in some sense, it's rooted to your own perspective. But it's rooted specifically into how you know that the present context is engineered. I'm using the word how and engineer to be somewhat synonymous. Yeah, I feel like I am slightly failing here because I'm using words which are very cerebral, and perhaps I can't find the exact, sort of key to sort of, in a more pure way, describe this form of appraisal. But in some sense, I think as well the word constructing value in the present context, or purviewing the value of the present context. Yeah, perhaps saying things like the intuition from the present's perspective, that is a bit of even a problematic metaphor. So perhaps I'll just say that should be rescinded. Okay, so I guess let me just move on, or I'll be here all day. So dimension 9. Now we're making the big break. Oh, by the way, I often connotate dimension 8 with the Earth. So this is the last dimension, and all the dimensions below it, in some sense, are in the realm of the Earth. Then everything above dimension 8 I consider to be a sphere of heaven, as it were. But anyway, okay, so dimension 9 is a form of introverted thinking. It takes the form of why things will be, or why it will be. So a cognitive operation that takes the formulation of why things will be is that you have a hope for why it will be. You have an account as to why you think it will be. You have a good account. So everything else after this is just a facet of hope. So they only function as a form of hope. So, it's just sort of how good is the hope, like now I'm going to go into more nuanced things about it. So I think hope is very important in the intellect. You cannot, look, I've already conceded that now I'm no longer in the earth. So now things are going to start getting esoteric. But essentially, the reason why hope is a kind of introverted thinking, why things will be, why it will be, you could say that that's you're going to have to give an account of that. And well, that's just your hope, man. You can be very nihilistic about this. You can just be like, well, no, I'm not interested in what you have to say because that's just what you hope that to be true. Well, yes, I mean you can always beat someone over the stick, beat someone with the intellectual stick that that they're just hoping that it's true. Because otherwise, why would they say it if it didn't resonate with their hope? So, oh yeah, you're just inclined to that because you hope that it's true. It's like, well, I mean, if that's going to be your sort of your straw man tear down, if you can't look at something because you hope that it might be true, you can just see the kind of the toxic skepticism and how it can be used to not get anywhere interesting, essentially, because essentially everything at some point is just a valence within hope, or a facet within hope, a more specific, particularized vision or um, corridor within hope. And if you don't hope, then what's how can you even discern anything if you can't even be honest that this is what you hope for? So somehow we're supposed to believe that you're doing anything intellectual um, from an apathetic perch, so that you're equally disposed to somehow have a plurality of cognitive dissonance. So you have no cohesive thread, that is going to definitionally culminate into something that could be called coherent. So hope here, why things will be. So I mean, you have to realize that everything above dimension 9 is only going to confirm your sense of why things will be. And now hope is powerful in its vagueness, in its I've said the wrong thing. I've said the opposite thing. It's not Hope is powerful in its broadness, not in its vagueness. It's powerful in its broadness. It needs to be broad and encompassing so that its principles can match up with the more nuanced facets that will come in the later dimensions. So to have a good hope is really a hope that can never die, a hope that can uh, resurrect itself. Within setbacks within its own internal, to have an eternal hope, I guess, is something that guess the thing here to remember is that this is coming off the back of dimension 8. So dimension 8, how things would be, that then is operated from the more esoteric perch of why things will be, or that, when how things would be is taken for granted in terms of why things will be. You can change your appraisal of how things would be and still apply the same hope in style, but obviously it will be subject to a different um, sort of field of application, as it were. And so this is why there's a kind of important divide between 8 and 9, is that 9 and above can operate as a kind of as a unit that has to be configured independently and then can be applied to changes in the earlier stacking in some sense. So it's just it's interesting that there is a kind of that there's something about dimension 9 which makes it kind of unique and peculiar, that it sticks out as a break. You could also maybe call it the door to heaven as well, but I link it to the apostle, but also to specifically discerning. The ability to be able to discern things, to discern why things will be, the power to do that is an independent application of the appraisal of something. Another thing that's also a bit weird to point out and to emphasize at this point, that I didn't do it sooner, is that higher dimensions can direct things on the lower dimensions. In some sense, you can imagine that the higher dimension is like the boss of the lower dimension, because it can see further, because it's higher up. That analogy also kind of falls down a little bit, because essentially it operates in a distinctly different way to the lower dimensions, but it depends on the lower dimensions being broad enough to support it, being broad enough to support the higher operationing. So, sometimes there can not be many, at some point a manager can only manage subordinates, cannot supplement the work done by the actual subordinate directly, but can sort of control and direct. So there's a bit of a so direct is not the same thing as command, reality of the lower dimensions. Anyway, okay, so why things will be, okay, things will get a lot clearer when I move up from dimension 9, but I mean, it's sometimes easier to understand a dimension in the context of the one after it as well, because then it kind of puts it in its place and kind of in the natural hierarchy. Okay, dimension 10 is extroverted thinking, and that takes the form of what should be. So operations of cognition that conform to the formulation of what should be is your trust of what should be, or is your sense of trusting something. And in some sense, you can only trust something to the extent to which you understand, you've modeled it in a comprehensive combined way what their internal discerning is. Like, you can only trust something if you know what it hopes for. To the extent to which that something has a consistent hope, you can trust it, or a coherent hope that you can discern, and that you can track how that hope changes maybe its form. But essentially, you can only trust someone's character, and you can only know someone's character to the extent to which you are familiar with the, let's say, the consistency in which that they hope. So, yeah, that's an interesting sort of thing. But in some sense, you could say that trust is the external, or the strategy or the plan. Yeah, this is where I kind of started talking about plans. When you're making a plan, trust gives you a sense of the kinds of motions that the models in your plan are capable of performing, and are, in a sense, the likelihood of them performing those motions or something like that. So it's sort of like a so trust is a very important way um, of holding together a model that has any kind of fidelity, I guess you could say. Uh, so I mean, trust. I mean, perhaps I shouldn't say plan. I should. When I say plan, I mean to use that word because I'm trying to connotate how much confidence you can have in this form of thinking. That it's like the integrity of your planning would be to say the confidence that you have that, I mean, it's not that this dimension is the same as planning, but it's essentially, if you were to analogize it as making a plan from it, it would tell you how much confidence you had in the stability of those plans, or in the composition of the objects that you have tracked within what should be. So it's similar to the salt. It's similar to the lattice in Fi of eminence. It's similar to eminence, but it's kind of on the inside. It's almost like the interior view of the external eminence of someone, of how they receive things from the outside. This is almost how you know it from the inside. How much trust you have and how they operate on the inside, um, and how reliably you can model them as an operator, whatever. So how much trust you can have that they will continue to have the same characteristics and the same types of motions or whatever, um, or the same range of motional potential, sort of. Anyway, so yeah, I'm using the word plan to kind of to espouse more descriptive mass on this or whatever. Okay, so anyway, dimension 10 is extroverted thinking, is what should be. Okay, dimension 11 is now the first member of the Trinity proper. Dimension 11 is a form of extroverted intuition, and it is I am what I am. And in some sense, this is something that you can't really decompose too much. People, I mean, this is commentary. This is pure commentary at this point. But essentially, the Holy Ghost is a very important aspect in consciousness, because if you try to replace the concept of I am what I am with something else other than how this dimension operates, if you try to replace it with a model of something else, you've just introduced the knowledge of good and evil, and you've created a kind of a theory to replace yourself, to replace the process of life, because you've displaced yourself with a generalization or with a model or something like that, where you're trying to look at yourself as an object from maybe the perspective of your future self or something. I don't know, you have to have a theory about time, and you have to have a theory about looking at yourself from where the outcome that you want to arrive at, or something like that. You'll go completely crazy. Um, this is what the false. I haven't talked about in this recording. I haven't talked about that, but this is how people's personalities are fallen. Is because they see themselves in such a way. Actually, the thing that's being messed up is actually being messed up on higher dimensions. It's being messed up on the 14th dimension, but essentially that 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 interference, that corruption, is also as a consequence preventing you from engaging in this dimension, in I am what I am. uh, in some sense, you could say, I mean, the reason why all of this happens, and I'm maybe introducing this at the wrong time, this kind of commentary, is that in some sense you could say it directs your trust as well. I mean, it also sort of destroys that, probably, because your model of trust is this kind of external locus of control, is this sort of this stuff is actually better explored in the 14th dimension. But anyway, so what can I say about this dimension? Yeah, so basically, if you take trust for granted, and then you say, I am what I am. The thing is I mean, this is actually a very mysterious cognitive function. It's hard to get into the kind of the esoteric aspect of it. Because things just get more esoteric after this, but it does get slightly easier. Is that in order to have a scope of possibility, uh, you cannot camouflage what you are. I'm trying to define it by negatively defining it, by saying what it isn't, I guess. So I'm not going to be able to define it positively. Um, Perhaps I could, with some philosophizing, express this a much better. But essentially, the sort of mysterious thing about it is that you can't know it. You're not allowed, it's kind of, it's a bit forbidden to decompose what it is into something else. So this is a form of introverted intuition. This is a form of extroverted intuition that is premised on a kind of on a unity. Oh, that was just like an earthquake. It's a bit weird. Anyway, when I say that you cannot decompose it, is because if you were to decompose it into parts, you would be uh, destroying your ability to um, allow this unity, or this pivotal construct to operate in a way that distinguishes an independent sort of agent within a realm that. So yeah, this is, it's so esoteric. I'm just going to have to talk about it in broad terms. So essentially, what this does is it means that you can live in the world but not be part of the world, because this is calibrating the difference between those things in the background without you having to take the background point of view. So if you decompose this dimension an into an explicit understanding or something like that, um, you have created a mechanistic reduction of something that literally decomposes uh, the unity of I shouldn't say unity, is I should say sort of the integrity of yourself. So if you degrade uh, this form of extroverted intuition, if you collapse that into a reduction, which will have to be disembodied, it'll have to use generalizations. You at the same time dispel the meaning of the object yourself as in a what. Like, what you are no longer becomes a yourself. It becomes, uh, maybe in some kind of timeless hypothetical, it becomes an anyone. You stop being yourself and you start being anyone. Um, this is strange because that construct is often a direct displacement of yourself. It's often something like yourself in the future. That if you are being commanded according to the outcome of what your future self is meant to be as an identity. Yeah, okay. I mean, oh yeah, I should have used the word identity. That would have made it so much easier. If you create an identity in the mind that displaces "I am what I am," then that identity, if you think that you can speak to that identity, because it's meant, in some sense, abstract. Look, conceptually, you can say it is. I can make such an identity. I can make that in my mind, and I can relate to it, and I can pretend to talk to it. I can pretend to see it. I can pretend to understand it. But that isn't I am what I am. I am what I am is something that I can't know myself. It's forbidden knowledge. I can't see myself from beyond myself. I can't know I am what I am. That's why it's the Holy Ghost. You can live in the Holy Ghost, but you can't see yourself from the perspective of the Holy Ghost. And if I make an identity of myself, I'm effectively making a bit of an idolatry of this extroverted intuition, which then is is suggesting to me general rules of sort of uh, it's sort of is telling me sort of the rules of how that extroverted intuition can be particularly accessed. It suggests to me to go one way instead of another way. Um, and either, I mean, it's even it's paradoxical. It's so confused. It's either that the NE is telling this to my identity and not to me, or my identity is telling this to me, and the identity is my extroverted intuition. You can kind of they're both narratives, and they're both problematic because they both, in fact, supplant the actual extroverted intuition here. And so the problem is that, let's just say that you were using this form of extroverted intuition properly, and you didn't have an identity filtering it. Um, so, in some sense, the important thing here is that this form of extroverted intuition works because you know that there is such a thing as I am what I am, but you know that it's forbidden. You know that you can't know it. You know that it's real, but you know that you can't know it. That's what this form of extroverted intuition is. That in that humility of not knowing what it is that I am what I am, then you can live I am what I am instead. You can actually embody it. You can actualize it. You are in the process of doing it rather than in knowing it, because it's impossible to know it. So you cannot know it. That is what this extroverted intuition is that you don't know. you don't know. So what's possible when you don't know? It's a very esoteric form of extroverted intuition. The only thing that you know is what you don't know. That's this form of extroverted intuition. Okay, it took me a long time. I'm going to move on. But I got it in the end. Okay, dimension 12 is a form of introverted intuition. So, dimension 12 is operations in the formulation of why things are or why it is. So, if you have a picture of why things are, you have an account of why things are, you can almost imagine it as the strength of vision that you have on the objects in your mind in some sense. So it's like if you know why things are, you know the context, you know their situation, you know their propensity. Perhaps it gives you a density of clarity on 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 why things are in the position that they're in. So it gives you a backstory. You know, in almost metaphorically, it gives you a history, but one. It's not so much of a. I mean that I'm using it as a metaphor. I don't believe in that there is such a thing as the past, other than in grammatical. It's a kind of like a grammatical metaphor. That's why we even develop such things as like the timeline concept. Um, but metaphysically and philosophically, it's completely. I mean, literally, it makes people insane. Uh, so why things are, in some sense, can be like how much awareness you have, how much vision you have in being able to animate things. Because if you know why things are, if you have a sense of why things are, there's a certain richness to what you're able to contemplate in terms of the again, like, the density of the picture that you can sort of create in your plan, as in like your plan. So your plan that already includes things that that you can't know certain things, that things will be a potential, but then beyond what you don't know, you know why things are. So you have some light, you know what you don't know, but then there's light to be shone in what is left over after what you don't know. So you can track things, you can evaluate things based on an account that you can give to them. Now, okay, dimension 12, I call liberty, and it's very much connected with the concept of reason itself. So why things are reasons. You can discern reasons. You can give an account as to your substantiation of why things are. You know the reasons of things. And this gives you a kind of a liberty in which to act, a liberty within which to operate. So if you know why things are, you have reasons that can back yourself up in the liberty that you take. So yes, people can say, I mean, that's all we can do to substantiate ourselves. Is you have reasons, I have reasons. Let's see who has more light to shed. on the matter, maybe we can combine the reasons and convince each other and negotiate our reasons. If they be incompatible, maybe we can reconcile our reasons. So it gives a certain scope of liberty, why things are, thoughts in the formulation of why things are. We can joust and contest each other's reasons. We can see whose reason. Okay, I'm just going to move on slightly because reason itself, dimension 12, is a little bit. It's a little bit up in the air until you reach the next dimension, because the next dimension really kind of brings things together nicely. So dimension 13 is another form of introverted intuition, and there are only two forms of introverted intuition in the whole 17 model, and they fall right after each other. So that's a very interesting asymmetry, but anyway, let me continue. Dimension 13 is why things would be. So why it would be, or why things would be. And this I call faith. So if you can understand that why things would be, I'm having a little bit, it is esoteric, so these are actually very hard to get through because they're so esoteric, but the best kind of definition that I've come up with is that it is the purpose and consequences of actions. So having a purpose for the consequences of your actions, or having the sensibility of the purpose in the consequences of actions, because it is slightly more generalized. Like, it's weird, it's sort of particular and general, because in some sense, if you have faith, you can, in the form of why things would be, you can rank order sentiments. You can say some sentiments are more good than other sentiments because they take cognizance of more things, of how they need to work together, of what it would look like if that sentiment was actually done. Like this, I mean, I guess you can have faith in many things. You can have faith in things that have not happened. You can have faith in things that are happening, or something like that. I mean, it's a bit of a strange thing to say that you can rank order them, but in some sense you can say that what I'm trying to exemplify is that if you have faith, then you would know, essentially, you would perhaps be able to prioritize why some articles of faith. It's not about priority. That's a way of me explaining it, but it's not about priority. It's about that how certain things are important because they amount to permitting certain goodnesses, that they facilitate the purpose, a broad purpose, a deep purpose, that how they integrate and how they so in some sense it's a very intellectual thing, that how things work, because faith is like, if you don't understand how things work, if you don't understand why it would be, or why things would be, if you've got the wrong faith for the job, then like maybe it's the wrong job. Maybe you shouldn't even be doing anything, because you don't. If you've brought the wrong tool for the job, then it's like you might think that you can get the job done and that you're fixing it, but if it's the wrong tool for the job, then actually maybe you're making it worse. Maybe you'll think that you fixed it and that your tools didn't quite fit the job, but actually what your idea of fixing it meant like destroyed the thing, because you didn't understand, like, so it's more about understanding the consequences of how, and I said how, of why things would be, um, well, the effect of why things would be, obviously, if it's almost like a semantic sort of tautology, but why things would be, I mean, the best thing that, I mean, it really does have to something to do with, like, the aftermath of something, like the full broad effects of things, and then being able to kind of have an idea of how much you endorse the purpose of those effects. So, I mean, it is also, in some sense, a kind of a rating of how important a purpose is. I mean, I do think that one of the consequences of faith is that you would be able to rank order actions in terms of their efficaciousness, in terms of fulfilling your own sense of what you have faith in, like what would, serve your faith, uh, what would be the service in line with your faith, uh, to greater or lesser effect. Uh, so I mean, it does have a lot to do with, seeing the consequences of actions. Yeah, and I haven't quite worked out how to explain this in terms of, purpose, because it's not just consequences of actions. It also has to do with, um, the effect of an action on your sense of the effect of actions in terms of purpose. Oh my word, yeah, that's so wordy. And okay, I need to think about how to express that in a more simple way. But it is a, okay. Let me move on. The next thing, it starts getting, the last four dimensions are actually much easier for me. Okay, so dimension 14 is a form of introverted thinking, and it is the Word. It is the second part of the Trinity, um, at least in this order. And essentially, how the Word operates is, and I also call the Word I am how I am. So how I am is how it's actually engineered. So I am how I am is the Word. The main functioning of the Word is that it has to blame itself. The main way to make sure that the Word is working is that it takes blame for everything. The Word is accountable. The Word is responsible for everything. That's just how it functions. So, and it is capable also of dying and being reborn. So your TI matrix, the thing that actually has objects in your mind, the space that contains objects in your mind, that is this TI proper. And essentially, all those objects, now the space is eternal, and just give me that as a philosophical presupposition, but or let's just, it's infinite, it has infinite room there. You can, you know, at least that's how we treat it as it's in our mind. Um, and you can put things there to think about. You can it can contain objects. Now you can destroy those objects and replace them with new objects. Now the thing is that when you do that, you just have to remember that it's not different. It's still the same. It's the same identity in some sense. It's still I am how I am. It's just in a different state now. It's in a different form. And so you can't just empty it and then forget about the contents that used to be in it. Um, I mean, it is possible that you can get to a point where the old contents don't matter anymore, in some sense. But it's sort of yeah, that's a bit of a this has what I'm saying actually refers to the next dimension, to the 15th dimension, about residual charge, as it were. But in any way, it has to have the same name. It has to have the same. So it can't lie to itself, as it were. So it's allowed to die and be reborn. It just has to keep on saying that about it. Yeah, I died and I was reborn, so it's fine. You know, so, you know, okay, man. So anyway, the important thing is that the objects that furnish it are made out of blame. It can contain anything, because it is responsible for all of its contents, because its contents are made out of its own blame. So as it blames itself, it makes objects. So all those objects that are contained therein by it belong to it. It is owned by those things. So it has full control over them because it has all the blame for all of them. And so if if it says, oh, I made a mistake, ooh, it's not my fault, I made a mistake, I mean, that can also be true. That uh, well, I mean, I guess it's always its fault, but um, so it does take the blame. But oh my word. You see, I mean, you can get into semantic. Essentially, the only thing it can get into semantic knots, but they aren't real semantic knots unless, I mean, they aren't real problems unless unless it's trying essentially to negate its own reality or its own consistency. Um, and it can be inconsistent with itself, and it can get forgiveness from itself for being inconsistent with itself, but it has to blame itself for forgiving itself. You see, so it can have whatever object it wants to have, as long as it blames itself for having that object, and that object is going to have a lineage, it's going to have a recourse, it's going to have a record attached to it, and the record will be added to, um, and it can be recontextualized by the latest configuration, the latest subset of objects. It just can't be a different name. That's it. It just has the same. It can't change its name. I mean, it can change its name if it blames itself for changing its name. But when I say name, I mean that in a technical sense. I mean that in the sense of how it knows itself. Because it can't stop how it knows itself. So it, I would say that sort of eternity is one of its sort of fundamental features, but I'm not really exploring the aspects of this that I wanted to explore. I've kind of a little bit lost my style in terms of how I was explaining it to this person that I was explaining it to. But anyway, I'll plod along, and maybe it's close enough. But essentially, the important thing is that the blame must rest on this central foundation, that there is one source of blame, and it's inside you, and it is the word. It is the thing that makes meaning. It's one of the prime drivers of consciousness. It's one of the prime parts of the awareness of the awareness. And it blames itself, and that is how it owns everything. And it's written in the record of that blame, and that's how it has an internal locus of control. And it gets into problems when it has objects, it has furniture in that space, and it believes that it has furniture in that space because of a fictitious theory, because of a narrative that it has been granted that object from an external source. And so it blames itself for taking on an object that it has inherited or that it has been imposed on with by some other entity. And this is very problematic, because essentially then you are enslaved by that other thing. It is being subservient in a way in which it disrupts its own. It's kind of corrupted and obscured its own view of how its blame resulted in the fidelity and the integrity of this piece of furniture in the mind, this object in the mind, that it did not create out of its blame, but it accepted because of its blame, and it came from some alien outside sort of external authority. And so it cannot accept another source of authority. And so what it does is it kind of loses track of its own sense of self-blame, as it were. You can see what I'm basically, when I say self-blame, I'm almost describing more about introverted intuition. I'm describing how the reason gets corrupted on dimension 12 in the disruption of this dimension 14. That reason itself has to start creating these ad hoc moves. Okay, this gets slightly more interesting on the next dimension, because this theme is kind of revisited. So then if you blame your own, let's say, core of your mind for the objects, then essentially you have no external recourse, and you just need to kind of always, if something bad happens, or you can't get to grips with something, well, it's because you don't have the right furniture. You need to change things up. You need to organize your mind differently. It doesn't matter if you were nascent or ignorant or something like that. The configuration of that TI, you are morally responsible for producing the okay, I don't want to make too much of a universal claim about morality, because in some sense I'm not talking about like the outcome of physical things that happen. I'm talking about the outcome of contemplative structures and the framework of your internal schema. So like, you can't say, well, no, my schema was bad, therefore don't hold me accountable because the structure of my schema on this dimension was misled. It cannot be misled. It's you operating it. It's how you operated the word. I am how I am. That is the name of this part and faculty of consciousness, um, which is very deeply connected to the the core of your spirit, which is the thing that is housed by your, um, which is the understanding that is running your consciousness, and this is that component of that understanding. Um, and so to say that you were misled by I am how I am is to repudiate how I am functions within you, and in some sense to continue this narrative of some kind of external locus of control or something, but and to not take responsibility. Um, okay, it's too complicated for me to go into further more commentary. Let me just continue. So dimension 15 then is introverted sensing, and it is what things are. So based on that TI from before, now you can actually operate over what things are. And you can actually have a real exuberance. I actually call what things are exuberance, because you can really resonate on a spiritual level in terms of what things mean, or in terms of being in an experience of what things are, that contain what things are. So things have a spiritual connotation to them. So this is a form of introverted sensing of what things are, that they're grounded in. They have what things are have encoded within them this kind of this TI subset, so they are supported by that TI, and that allows you to kind of keep references of then that form of introverted sensing of what things are, because they have a definitional recourse in what things are, because this is on top of dimension 14. And this is also why then, when people come across objects from earlier times in their life, when they've perhaps changed some of the furniture in their TI, then there is there's a nostalgia, um, usually because as people get older, they sacrifice more of their own internal locus of control, and the use of this TI, they sacrifice it over to a kind of an alignment of a corrupted theory, usually to do with time, because as time becomes the agent and you lose your agency and you lose the blame on your own use of TI, and you say that time is the real agent and I'm just experiencing what time is doing to my past and my present and my future, in the same process or whatever, that your exuberance over what things are gets lost. This kind of exuberance, I would link it roughly to Malkuth in the Tree of Life, sort of Kabbalah system, although anyway, I've got other sort of versions of that, but um, I link it to the kingdom as well. So the kingdom would, as a esoteric commentary, would be somewhat connected to this form of exuberance of what things are. And then dimension 16 is I am why I am, which is also the Father, and it's a form of extroverted feeling. Oh, just to emphasize, on dimension 15, you don't exclusively have those what things are. What things are is a generalized sort of ideal form resonance or whatever. So like, they're not exclusively your virtues. They are things that other people can have, but you recognize them, um, and you give them that spiritual sort of meaning and connotation, perhaps, that is encoded within your own TI system, as it were. Okay, so I am why I am is a form of extroverted feeling, because essentially, after you have a set of what things are, then you can actually, everything can be translated into what things are, and then there's a maneuvering that can happen between what things are. There's a kind of, you have a full set of chess pieces, as it were, and certain kind of possibilities, like, because, after you've kind of inculcated this paradigm of what things are, you've got all these figurines and how they can interact with one another, and there are only sort of certain ways in which there's a harmonious reconciliation in how these things can interact with one another, and how they might be moved along, and so the kind of the extroverted feeling interaction of these things is the paradigm of the Father. I am why I am, sort of, which, knowing the kind of, just read my technical definition of extroverted feeling again. The determination of expression by realizing the potential of situation. So it gives you a sense of that, what that potential is for interaction between these different figures. And in some sense, you could say that, again, you can't really you can have a sense of this, but you can't really, like, this is a very ephemeral, esoteric, sort of, form of extroverted feeling. It's not, you're looking at the situation out, in almost in an objective sense, in objective, I'm using that descriptively, with reference to what things are, which are defined by your own spiritual understanding of your TI matrix of dimension 14. So it's just essentially a sense. It's a broad FE sense of things. It's not, it's something that you can enjoy the spirit of the Father, but it's not always, I mean, that's what I link dimension 16 to, is the Father. And it's like, in some sense, it's always there, and it's there perhaps in different strengths, in different degrees, in different contexts, depending on how much SI you have accumulated around you, as it were. In the sense of SI in dimension 15. But I mean, this also can be present in all the other dimensions below it. So this can be present in the fourth dimension, SI. What would be, your suggestion of what would be, can have, at a very nuanced, sophisticated level within itself, can also resonate with everyone. I think has an as a latent impact of what they are expressing on the 16th dimension. They are saying something about I am why I am. They're saying something about their condition of I am why I am. They are giving an account for their figurine in the drama or in the interaction of all the what things are. Okay. The last dimension, dimension 17, is how things are. And this is interestingly above the Father. And I call this dimension tranquility. And I link it to the gift of the prophet. And I'll just say that how things are is the capstone of, if you put this into a 17-step pyramid, it is the pinnacle of the pyramid. And how things are reaches the point of the pyramid. And remember that I said that something is all the dimensions below it as well. Something happening on a certain dimension is also means that there's something almost sympathetically happening on all the other dimensions that it is the same thing. So dimension 17 is working with all the dimensions. So it's the only dimension that implies movement or motion or some kind of action or operation on all the dimensions simultaneously. So in some sense, it's the whole thing operating at once. And then if it's operating with dimension 1, you can almost see that, well, dimension 1 is the base of the pyramid and dimension 17 is the tip of the pyramid. So if they're working together, you can see that it's sort of the whole base of the pyramid and the very center of the pyramid is happening at the same time. So the top becomes the bottom because the top is merely the central point of the bottom, and the top also includes the bottom because it's carried by the weight of the base of the pyramid. So 17 is the most sort of present. I don't know if I said it's it's extroverted sensing. So dimension 17 extroverted sensing, how things are, is a very visceral, immediate, but detailed, but also all pervasive reduction. It's almost like one side of, in quantum mechanics where, the uncertainty principle. It's almost like the destruction of the uncertainty principle. It's that you can actually measure exactly something precisely. Well, if you measure, if you, I mean, what the uncertainty principle means is that if you know the momentum of something, you don't know its position, and if you know its position, then you don't know its momentum. To the degree to which you have more information of the one, it starts to degrade the information of the other. That is essentially the uncertainty principle. And somehow dimension 17 is like the thing that regulates or collapses that in some sense, because dimension 17 would be like the collapse and dimension 1 would be like the waveform. Okay, apart from the abstract scientific sort of metaphor there, which is quite interesting, because I would say that, quantum mechanics very clearly debunks the methodology of science, because science determines predictability, and yet we know from quantum mechanics that the universe is probabilistic. So already there is a refutation in the kind of the philosophical presupposition that is made for science to get off the ground, which is that it presumes that time is this law ordering paradigm that everything is happening within the medium thereof, but it just presumes that. It doesn't prove it, and therefore it also can't tell us anything about time, which I stated earlier. But people don't realize that it's actually displaced Ti. I did actually explain that earlier, so I'm not going to repeat it, but I need to make a separate recording on morality and generalizations. And let me say, I've been going through. Okay, now I want to get to this. I did want to reach this point. Now I've gone through all these cognitive functions now in this recording, and I just want you to notice that, like, some of the words will, how things will be, what will be, why it will be. Will. This seems to suggest a future. Nothing that I said suggests a past. Nothing that I said has a history in it, except if you maybe want to say the word how maybe is equally applicable to the present as it is to the past, as it is to the future. If you already believe that there is such a category as past and future, you can maybe believe that how applies to all of them, or that it should equally apply to all of them, although perhaps it's only pertinent in the present and the future, and that what maybe most suggestively implies that there is something that is left behind. There is there is something that can be forgotten, that would be a true fact that might be forgotten and lost because it's no longer before us, or it's no longer immediately in front of us, and now it excuse perhaps the confusing suggestion when I use the phrase before us, but I would just like to point out that yes, these words will and how and what, they connotate to us to maybe make a theory of a timeline, a narrative about time. This is a corruption. This is not true. When we talk about time, we do so often in our current contemporary culture with a reference to the scientific reliance on time, is that we exist inside of time. We exist inside of the present. That's the only thing we know, is that we live inside of the present. And we can talk about the future as we can also talk about the past. But how do we know that the past is real? We can have an argument about it. But the only way that we can know that it's real is because we can say, well, my psychological interpretation and schema and construct depends on it. And I need that dependency to be validated, and so let's all agree in it, or something like that. Okay, let me explain why I think that we get to this corrupted point. We get to this corrupted point because grammar, meaning, and I've used a lot of the core components of meaning, these in even my own cognitive functions, that they metaphorically can amount to a generalization, to a narrative that maybe loosely describes a timeline. That you can kind of say, well, things that talk about what would be is almost future orientated, and what is, you could say, well, what is has to kind of wait for us in the past until we attend to it, and it can kind of haunt us and creep up on us as our past gets accumulated as a what things are, or something like that. This is an illusion. It's an illusion of a metaphor that relies on an objective exterior locus of control, some kind of so-called objective paradigm, that then we are forced to disembody yourself. You can't see things from your own perspective anymore. You have to see things from that perspective, from the perspective of the paradigm. And because you aren't that thing, you have to imagine what life looks like from that perspective. So now you have been completely enslaved by your theory of this objective external locus of control and authority, that has authority over the truth, that you then think that is how you make meaning of things. Because if I can't say, oh, I'm holding my breath for 40 seconds, what am I saying? What am I describing, actually, when I say that? Am I talking about a block in... Am I talking about a block within the timeline? Or am I just describing to you a power that I possess? When I say I can do something for 40 seconds, if I can hold my breath for 40 seconds, what does can mean? That doesn't mean that I am doing it now. That means I have the power to do it. So I have the power. Well, do I have the power to do it? Will I do it? is I would say is a question maybe about the future, if that'll happen. But when does the future ever happen? When does the future ever come? We can only ever operate in the present. We can only ever act in the present. So when we think that we're talking about the future, we're talking about a fiction, talking about a metaphor in the meaning of what we mean, and we don't have to refer to this timeline, to this narrative, or this fictitious paradigm. We don't have to model it in that at all. We can humanize this, and it will make much more sense. What are we actually talking about? We're talking about people's powers, people's potentials, we're describing. Are we describing a duration of a block of the timeline? Or are we describing a capability that someone professes to have? I mean, you can argue, well, no, it's a fact that I did do this. I did do this. It happened to me in the past. What did it happen to? Did it happen to your identity? Or did it happen to yourself? Who are you? Are you your past? I would argue it happened to somebody else. And you would argue back, and the argument would be insoluble. And you would say, no, I am my past. I am who I was. What does this mean? I am who I was. This is anti. I mean, people will call me an anti-realist. I would say that if you're not an anti-realist like I am, then you're an anti-reasonist. You don't know what reason is. There are broader ways of going into this, and I need to make a separate recording that talks about morality and generalizations and time. But another way of looking at this is, look, there are valid ways that you can maybe talk about the past, but then you can't talk about the future. And so I would say that you can have the present and the past, and you can have the past and the future. But you can't have both without a slave morality, without having an external locus of control and trying to see things from that disembodied paradigm. And I would say that it happens in this way, that if you want to talk about the past, what you're in fact doing is you are unpacking the past, you're unfolding it, you're recontextualizing it. By acting in the present, you can reformulate the past by adding to it. So you can augment the past by addition. And if you can recontextualize something, well, it's a matter of argument how much you can actually potentially fully control it or command it with the right amount of feeling of capability in the present. In some sense, you will feel as capable to command the past as you are able to access all the recesses of the past by your interaction in the present. And so in some sense you could say that perhaps a valid way of looking at the past is that it is the resources that you have available to you in your narrative, but that narrative is fundamentally a fiction. So fictitiously you are empowered by your history or disempowered by your history, and that gives you a set of instruments and tools that you have to work with in the present and to work on the present with, that you've inherited. Oh, so well done. You've created a narrative in which you've got an inheritance. And then with that inheritance, you will have to deal with the problem of the collective unconscious, as it were, is that there are things in the past that No one remembers, that no one knows why we have the residue that we have inherited. There are things that have been lost, that their account, their reasoning is not with us anymore. It's fallen into darkness, into ignorance. No one alive knows about why this is the way it is. We've collectively, unconsciously inherited it. And now how do you have to deal with this? How can you deal with this? Well, it's like a black box. It's fundamentally, it's like Pandora's box. And this is the problem with the collective unconscious narrative, is that it forces you to look at the issue from the unknown, from the collective unconscious. You cannot talk about the collective unconscious without adopting the perspective of the collective unconscious, which means you are forced to not understand your perspective. So how do you know that you're not just talking nonsense? If you have to hypothetically take on a perspective of something that cannot be understood, can you imagine something that cannot be understood? If you say, yes, I think you're talking nonsense, I don't think you know what it is that you say, because I know that you don't know what it is that you say, because by your own admission, you don't understand it, but you say that you can imagine it. So what does that even mean? It means nonsense. So you have to answer no. If I say, can you imagine something that you don't understand or that you can't understand? I would say either one of those you can't do. Like, again, the only way to imagine something that you supposedly do not understand is if it is not something that you specifically do not understand, but it is something that you generally do not understand, and it forms part of a class of objects which can be understood, but which you have not understood yet. So part of the hypothetical is that it is understandable. But I would say that how do you encounter it if you do not understand it in your imagination? Then you have to know that it will be understood in some way, and you already have to have an idea of how it will be understood. I would say to sort of to sufficiently supply my thought experiment question. Anyway, how this that's abstract. Let me put it specifically with the problem with the collective unconscious is that there are some things that you can posit the collective unconscious, you can posit that narrative, which is the same as positing the fictitious narrative about history. You can say, well, there are things that we've forgotten, there are things that we don't know. But we can know where to find some of these things, because we know maybe where we can find the answer, because we know at some point our knowledge ends. We know things, and then we know that we don't know some things. And then we have unknown unknowns further on from there. So, but let's say on the cusp of that, we can say, well, let's try and fictitiously re-encounter the edge of our known history so that we can go beyond and look at the unknown. And where are we doing this? We're doing this in the present. So we can strategically work out how to create this fictitious model to guide us towards something. And what will we find? Who knows? But let's say we find something that we don't understand. But now that we're confronted with it, we can understand it. Should we understand it in the fictitious paradigm, in the narrative of that? Did the narrative tell us where to look? Did the narrative discover it for us? Did the narrative realize it into a tangible understanding? Did the narrative develop it? Or did we, being utilized by the narrative or getting some utility from the narrative, did we do all the work? And then we apportion it to the narrative. Oh, the collective unconscious precipitates us new things to be astounded by. And this is a disembodied narrative. This is a narrative that I would say is fundamentally fictitious. And if we can't understand what we come across, do we say, oh, the collective unconscious is mysterious and hard, it's impenetrable, we're not making ground? We failed the collective unconscious. We didn't bring the narrative to a conclusion. Or do we say that maybe there was nothing to be known? Maybe the limits of understanding and reason have nothing to do with this narrative of the collective unconscious. It has to do with the fact that we're looking at nothing. We're looking at random things, trying to project value onto it because something about a strange narrative that we had haunted us and whispered in our ears and told things to our identity that then we were enslaved by that identity that came to supplant ourselves. You know, it's just say, well, we don't understand it, but the collective unconscious knows what it is. This is insane. This is akin to devil worship, I would say. You're being driven by the spirit of the collective unconscious perspective, but also or it's a form of idolatry in some sense, to be more precise. But anyway, but it's to love that. It's in some sense it's to love not understanding. It's to love the darkness. It's not really see that you have really subjected yourself to a form of darkness, form of willful ignorance, so that you can get some utility out of this alien paradigm, this disembodied paradigm. Sorry, there was another element here that I want to bring up, which is that what you actually are dealing in, if you forget all that fictitious bullshit, is that you are encountering things in reality, in the present, never mind whatever narrative you can project onto it, and maybe you are investigating something. Maybe your investigation yields results. Maybe it yields more confusion. Maybe what you're looking at is not significant of anything that can be understood. Who knows? Maybe. But what can be done can be done. You know, what will be, as they say. You know, what you're going to do about it. You know, this alien context of what you have done has fallen short according to this historical narrative. I mean, there are deeper. I mean, this stuff comes out very strongly when you talk about identity politics and you talk about those sorts of problems, which are very, very pernicious. That kind of hack the same thing. I would say it's the same thing as science. Really is the same problem as science. The scientific mentality is exactly the same as identity politics. It's just it seems much more vicious and emotional on the level of sociology and politics as it does in the realm of the more dry intellectual, erudite, you know, sort of academic halls of you know this kind of this pretentious knowledge, which is very, you know, very in league with this idea that, you know, we're unpuzzling pieces of a grand external narrative that, we're making headway in, but we've got too many fragments and we can't put them together, or oh no, we're actually very close and it's all mathematical and we just don't fit into it. It's the problem is us, not science, or the thinking about it. It's always it's very it's very much, you can see parallels between that and identity politics. The problem is our inability to sympathize with the contemplative sort of narrative, and which is essentially a fiction. Anyway, I didn't do such a good job at debunking my problems with the collective unconscious sort of construct, but I will do that in another recording. But anyway, at least that this recording is a bit of a standalone for the 17 cognitive functions in some description. This is a postscript addendum that I'm just going to add to the recording. I want to revisit when I was talking about the 11th dimension, the Holy Ghost. I think I did say all basically the right things, but I just wanted to underline something that maybe didn't come out so clearly, which is that, it's a good way of seeing it sort of philosophically is like that it's forbidden knowledge, that you know what you can't know or what you don't know in some sense. Obviously, I would like to be to state it in the embodied immediate sense, is that it's not that you can't know it, that's a philosophical claim, it's that you actually, relative to yourself, you don't know it. And that if you pretend that you know it, it's a bit of a lie. In fact, it's actually a kind of it's a subversion of. That's why it's sort of forbidden knowledge, as it were. Because it's like, yeah, okay, so it is a kind of extroverted intuition, and in some sense it is a bit of a system, because it's a system that says this is the realm of possibility. Obviously it's a bit esoteric, so it's like possibility in the context of conceptualization, in terms of setting up systems of conceptualization, in terms of how to structure the notion of possibility and contemplation and hypothesis. So if you want to make a hypothesis, you can't just hypotheses, whatever the plural is. You're not able to just set up whatever contemplative paradigm that you so wish, because you might have actually brokered yourself into this forbidden knowledge, and actually, by thinking that you're dealing with these real things, actually you don't know what you're doing. You're in the realm that is void, that literally is in a contemplative it's you can't get into situations where you're utilizing suppositions, you're utilizing certain intrinsic premises which literally dissolve or disintegrate what is requisite to have a yourself. So I mean, essentially, this is almost is archetypally depicted by the serpent in Genesis, because the serpent is camouflaged in the world. You can't see it; it's indistinguishable from its environment. It is part of the environmental it doesn't make the distinction between itself and its or it seeks to blend into the into its environment. It doesn't have a delineated border that separates its distinct um, functioning. Uh, its functioning is well, I mean, it functions on the pretense that uh, it can be disguised by um, a collective uh, paradigm that uh, I mean, it's not that sort of snakes are evil or something like that, but what they represent to us, what they represent in the understanding, is a strategy of being which is playing fast and loose with this external and internal locus of control, where the snake is, as a tactician, if you want to anthropomorphize its its characteristic uh, that it uses to um, I guess I'm getting lost in this metaphor, but let me draw it back slightly. So, I mean, in some sense, the fruit of the tree of life is something like uh, the the proper condition of the Holy Ghost, and the tree of the fruit of good and evil is the same tree, but it's being um, partaken of. That fruit is being partaken of with a different that the same it's the same fruit, but it almost matters who is eating it in some sense. And in some sense, there's a fundamental problem with, almost to use it as a metaphor, the evolutionary strategy of the snake is that it has no hope of ever, let's say, developing higher functions if it's sticking to the strategy of blending in with its environment, because it's not distinct enough as a you know, a snake has no appendages that allow it to grasp things. Um, you know, it's essentially a mouth and a stomach, and it crawls on its stomach. It crawls on its own hunger, and it tastes only dust. And that is what happens when you take the fruit of the tree of life and you don't feed on it, but you are eating it for your identity. You're eating it for how you're going to get along with your environment, how you're going to enhance some identity in a narrative that you are that you have contemplatively that you are contemplatively serving. And so as you are serving that future image of yourself, which you can't know what you will be in the future and how you will be in the future, and but specifically you can't know what you will be in the future, but because you've got a future image of yourself, you're no longer yourself. You are yourself in a narrative, yourself in a collective environment, in a and you are camouflaged by that environment, and in some sense you are overrun by that environment. Then what you are is merely a imprinted, conditioned um, that essentially the snake is held captive because its strategy is to be camouflaged by its environment. Therefore, it can develop no independent strategy of a kind of it cannot outwit its, if you want to sort of anthropomorphize it a bit, it can only outwit things in that way. It cannot outwit in any other way other than camouflage. So it's kind of it's so it's kind of a sneaky predator, and it can only ever do other things that are conjoined with the sneakiness. So it's a bit of a spiral that forces a kind of captivation, because now it must always be able to be disguised by its environment. It must always be able um, to be seamless with the narrative. And I mean, you can particularly see how it is particularly the enemy of the of an independent understanding that is not instinctually inculcated into um, subverting its own distinction between itself and its environment, because the snake will always have to evolve in conjunction with its environment, whereas the human is completely independent and can essentially evolve or develop um, because the understanding in the human has the potential to be the overriding conditioning principle and effect, that the selective pressure can be independently construed and emanate from the understanding itself. That the model that the understanding produces to live within, if it is properly gardened, to be pristine and to be functioning in a transparent and fluid and non-pathological way, uh, I do think consciousness does have an effect on biochemistry. So I'll just put that as a side note in terms of evolution. But anyway, I'm not going to broaden this too much. But did I make the point that I wanted to make? Okay, yeah. So apart from that whole trying to slog into that, I'm just going to say that the thing is that the Holy Ghost, the condition of your relationship to the Holy Ghost is representative of the boundary of yourself in extroverted intuition, contemplative terms. And there must be a responsible line that is held, that you know where the boundary is. In some sense, you can even use your extroverted intuition to penetrate that boundary. You can cross that border. You just have to know that what you're doing is void, is something that cannot be resorted to in terms of letting that supplant yourself or becoming something that you can invest a value into, or that you can use to base reasoning on top of. You can't put reasoning on top of that. You can't put anything else on top of that. Because essentially you've gone too far in terms of the extroverted intuition thing, and you've actually used extroverted intuition to decompile the source code. You know, you're trying to perform an invalid operation if you think that you're doing anything other than just sort of concocting nonsense. You know, and the thing is that I think people know that they're just talking nonsense. They know that they're just sort of, you know, like, I mean, I try to make this example myself or whatever, that, you know, so if you ask someone, can you imagine something that you don't understand? Because that is essentially what atheists need to rely on when they're making themselves enslaved and captive to this blind faith that, well, science is the best thing we've got and there's nothing else. You know, they play this kind of this weird sort of straw man thing, um, where they say, well, everything else is way worse, so this is the best, least bad answer, so we'll have to stick with that. That's their kind of you know, it's like, you know, they're always driving at extracting this sort of existential sympathy, um, as sort of like a source of authority, as if like, because this is the only thing that has a possible fruit that you're going to get at the end of it, because that's what they're doing. They're slithering on their hunger, tasting only dust, with the promise that their identity is going to have the hope of eating the fruit, as they are in the process of eating the fruit, but they taste only dust, because it's just more of this more moral authority that they essentially, what they lack in actually delivering the goods, they gain in this kind of never-ending ramping up of, oh yes, we're accruing more and more moral authority. Look at how pure our project is, and it's Anyway, and that's essentially because they've adopted an identity and a narrative that allows them to jump ship from yourself in terms of I am what I am. So in terms of the extroverted intuition of I am what I am, they don't know what they are. They're not themselves. Well, I mean, in some sense, actually, they are themselves. I was trying to say themselves in the singular, but that's exactly the problem. That's even what it says in Genesis. Um, Themselves. They'll be, because you have to collectivize it. You have to generalize it, so that then you can lean on this alien understanding that is an external locus of control. And for some people, that narrative is actually what they call the Christian God, or what they call God, or something like that. And it's the same false belief, because they're pretending to know something that they don't know, so that they can instead look at themselves from that perspective and get their identity from that collective. Because they don't want to be they don't want to be a yourself looking at it subjectively. They need to be in a narrative that is underpinned by this, that we're all in it together in the same existential sympathy, um, under the shadow of this sort of moral authority, which we can just grow in representation thereof by playing its game. And this is archetypally sort of summarized as the knowledge of good and evil. And this is the riddle of the cherubim that holds, the sword at the east of Eden, that, the sword that turns every way, is to overcome this problem in extroverted intuition. Is because how do you confront the sword that turns every way? And I'll just say that the sword is a symbol, is a spiritual symbol for the tongue, because the tongue speaks and it makes noises, and a sword that turns every way means, jungle noises. If you ever camp next to a jungle or something like that, and you hear the primates, you hear their tongue screaming, and it's turning every way. And what does this mean? What is this extroverted intuition? What are these people saying? Or these what are these primates saying about I am what I am? With these, uh, because in some sense that is I mean, really, if you hear a primate screaming, or not screaming, but vocalizing its non-language communication, that is, I mean, these creatures do not have understandings. They might be more intelligent than other creatures, but they don't have conceptualization, and they don't have understandings. But what they do have is something, that we can anthropomorphize about them. Uh, is that if we can imagine that they had a mind, their extroverted intuition goes all over the place. It goes where it wants to go. It won't hold itself to one side of a boundary in terms of its extroverted intuition. So it knows what it is, but no one else does, because its form of to anthropomorphize and say that it has a form of extroverted intuition, in its strange relativism. If we want to make that the standard and try to follow how that sword is cutting up uh, a matter, and it turns every way as it's cutting up a matter into component parts. I mean, that's probably. I'm describing the antithesis of the thing that I'm trying to explain, so it's probably not that useful. Um, but I think the problem has been in our species is that we stepped on the wrong side of the Holy Ghost, and then we haven't been able to delineate in our understanding the distinction. We have a vague sense of degree that some people maybe have it more correct than other people, but we don't have the delineated key to that riddle. And so to us, there's almost, when you're being cut by somebody else's words, when you're being cut by somebody else's, let's say, lack of cogency in terms of their extroverted intuition, we are being confronted by the chaos of the sword that is turning every way. And that really is the thing that keeps the way of the tree of life, which I believe is essentially the Holy Ghost, is one way of depicting the issue of the Holy Ghost in the context of the Genesis story. But I will explore these issues more thoroughly when when I make a recording about morality and time, and I'll try hone in on the more particular aspects of this, but it certainly is very relevant to certainly dimension 14, but also dimension 11. And whenever I think about this, I feel like I haven't explored it enough because, in terms of dimension, there was one thing that I wanted to say, which I still haven't said, which is that your treatment of this dimension is the system that underpins uh, in some sense, the 14th dimension, that TI, you have a certain vessel to place furnishings in, objects that are created out of your own epistemic responsibility, as it were. But in dimension 11, what what is being created is the membrane for that space. Without dimension 11, there is no solid outline for dimension 14 to to be that essentially the only limit on the blame that you can do in terms of dimension 14 is already pre-structured and pre-set up in dimension 11, where there are certain hard limits, because when you cross those limits you end up in paradox, you end up in self-contradiction, essentially, in a certain fundamental, that if you know certain things, you have uh, dispelled yourself from meaning, from being able to produce meaning, or to garner um, I was also going to move on and clean up one thing that I said in my ramblings at the end about time and stuff, and about, trying to go through some of those examples. And I think that one of those important things, which is worth emphasizing, is what did I say? Time. I was talking about. What was I talking about? And I'm blanking on that thread. Okay, now I've remembered. It's when I was talking about, like, I have an ability to hold my breath for 40 seconds. I'm just making up something that has to do with using time as a unit. That essentially, when you say I have, or I can hold my breath for 40 seconds, what you're talking about essentially is something that you have in the present, that you have the potential to do that. So when you say I can, you're saying I possess the ability. And I think that you can always relate time to a potency, into a positive trait. It doesn't, that when you conceptualize it in terms of the timeline, that's an abstract sort of projection, as it were. And it does have the corrupting effect that I went into, even that, that when then you start to think that time is the agent of all causation, that time is the determining factor. Um, People make this kind of mistake in lots of different places. It happens when people try to stand up for science as having some kind of truth value to it, um, which especially breaks down in the field of psychology, because everything that you're measuring in psychology is reported by an agent, and then you have essentially a kind of communications barrier between their actual conscious apperceptions and uh, the metrics that you are, because essentially the metrics that you're recording those apperceptions with. I mean, this is why you can't really ever have high quality science in psychology, is because you don't know how many variables are hidden until you start off your whole project with a closed and complete understanding. You have to already begin with a complete understanding. You can't start with a partial understanding that you're going to grow into a full understanding in the future. This is why this is why typologies with cognitive functions have a much better time of making any kind of progress, because at least then they've got a full set of things, and then maybe they can make more intricate, you know, they can end up delimiting and subdividing the categories that they already have. But because the categories that they already have are canonical in their set and are complete in their set, you actually have uh, something that can reflect uh, the component parts of an agent that that an agent could use to paint and reflect back to them a description of their own use of their agency in some sense. Um, and you can perhaps, in if you play around with that enough, perhaps you can discover all the moving parts, you know, in your interior use of consciousness or whatever. Um, the other sort of issue is that science posits determinism, and in some sense, it already posits that time is the prime agent, uh, which is also why you can't learn anything about time with science, because it's already presumed that science is, in some sense, the prime mover, in some sense, because everything is happening within time, within the field of time. Um, but then you have to understand that psychology could also never be a science, even if you could get a full understanding of it, because it would only be something that would be provable about an individual, in terms of it would be an account that an individual could give and and use as an explanation of themselves to another person, and perhaps be an understanding that they could pedagogically transmit. But it wouldn't really be capable of being used, that understanding wouldn't be capable of being used as a test for things. When I say a test for things, it would never be a I mean, any test for anything psychological would essentially first have to consist of some form of indoctrination. I mean, perhaps this is granted in psychometric testing already, that there is enough common language there for the communication to mean what it ostensibly, is. But in some sense, if you wanted to actually, if you wanted to ask anything about deeper structures of people's psychology, you would first have to teach them something about how to sort of label these things on the inside, because even if they experience them on the inside, So I mean, so unless questions were paragraphs long that had an introduction and then had a bit of a primer and then had a question to indicate some dichotomy, or at least some of the ways in which some dichotomy, at least a dichotomy, at least some distinction between two, or perhaps there are some things in which it goes one of three ways or one of four ways, or more, um, on some metric. Again, all of that means nothing in psychology if there's any doubt that you have hidden variables. If you have hidden variables, um, then you're not even testing them with an understanding. So this is the problem: is that hypotheses in psychology don't come packaged with theories of mind. So they're not even trying. They're not producing scientific hypotheses, and this also comes out in the weakness of most psychological studies. I think even the Big Five has a terrible rate at which it can be reliably reproduced. I've heard that essentially the only two things in psychology which have any kind of reliability in terms of reproducibility is IQ and I think some study about male suicide or something like that. I think those are the only things that can actually be reproduced in terms of predictions. But in terms of when you repeat the anyway, I'm going way off course, but the idea that if you had a true understanding of psychology, and then you would be able to kind of get certain things and do certain things with it upon people. Is to already sort of frame science as something that is only valuable or provable to the extent to which that it makes predictions. And in some sense, there is an impenetrable barrier here because behavior is not the same thing as internal cognition. It's funny how people have also even sort of tried to redefine psychology as behavior, which already means that they're not trying to understand the mind, trying to understand what the mind can be tested for. And to the degree to which you're sort of leaning into what the mind can be tested for, you are really trying to drive people towards some kind of lowest common denominator, in which what I would argue you're doing is you're weaponizing the fallacy of equivocation, in which you are going to use the reduction of someone's behavior to create distinctions which are fundamentally nebulous and that are good at hiding variables that are actual psychological features. So, that you will tend towards an anti-psychology, Um, while you continue, I mean, well, this is practically how psychology is being driven at the moment towards essentially a synthesis of, trying to come up with the most sort of crazy harebrained sort of thing that is at some point going to get married to neuroscience in some kind of computational interpretation of synapses and neurons. Um, because they're effectively trying to mimic what they see happening in the hard sciences, and they don't understand the philosophical ineptitude that the methodology of science uses and how it's effectively debunked itself after it discovered that the the reality that we live in is certainly not deterministic, which actually calls the methodology of science into question, um, and calls for at least a recapitulated intellectual framework in which to understand science. Uh, but instead, they just moved on to instead of thinking of mechanical determinism, now they think of statistical determinism and the predictability of statistical models without batting an eye. And then whenever the statistics don't line up to measured results, well, that's because your experiments were wrong, your sample size was wrong. It's you argue with reality, you don't argue with the theory. Uh, that's the level at which we're at now. Just demanding that we someone comes up with an AI to tell us that we'll never understand it, and that it understands it for us, and that's the purpose of building a brainiac AI machine, so that it can tell us that the time of humans is finished and that there's no such thing as human understanding because we just are all incapable of it, and it understands science for us, but it can't explain it to us because we're incompatible. That's what science is looking for now. It's looking for that level of validation because it's already done that with its Ponzi scheme. It's already done that with its uh, infallible white lab coats, and they're talking nonsense. They've broken, uh, let's say, the forbidden knowledge in terms of extroverted intuition, and they've created a TI cult of an external locus of control. Uh, they've gone out of their minds. Well, they've gone beyond their minds. Anyway, I'll end this addendum now.